Oh, that's right.
Livery and live and
All right. Now it says that we are live. I think that's how you pronounce that word. Hope everyone had a nice Thanksgiving, and we had our little Thanksgiving break, which means that we missed one of the very interesting episodes in Jacob's life, and the one that kind of explains why we are where we are when we reach this week's Torah portion of Vayeitzei. So last week, the most important part of Jacob was him having conflict with his brother Esau, the whole selling of the birthright, and then even more powerfully, the taking of the blessing that his father Isaac was trying to give. Esau is not happy about this, and therefore Rebekah and Jacob decide that discretion is the better part of valor, to get out of Dodge, head back to where Rivka was from, and find a nice girl to marry. So he goes back, he works for 7 years to marry his beautiful Rachel, and then in the morning he wakes up and finds it was Leah, right? And then he's like, wait a minute, Lavan, what are you doing here? I said Rachel, and he said, oh yes, but here we always marry the older first, right? And it's like, yeah, no. But he sticks with it anyway, and he sticks out a week worth of partying, because that's how long you celebrate a wedding. And then after that, he marries Rachel. And then he is on the clock. He is in debt to then work an additional 7 years in order to pay off the right to having married Rachel. Because remember, he showed up with nothing. Even though he is supposed to be the wonder kid who was going to get everything and be amazing and all of that, he is being taken advantage of, and his life is not so easy.
so he's 14 years.
14 years total. In paying off for the ladies. Yeah, paying off for the ladies. But he gets both of them after 7 years and 1 week. Right? So he doesn't have to wait 14 years before he's marrying Rachel. He's only waiting 7 years before he marries Rachel. But it's 1 week after he married Leah. So now both of them are co-wives for Jacob. So life's not so great if you're Jacob, right? Guess who else life is not so great for? Leah.
Yeah.
Right?
Leah.
Think about Leah.
Yeah, poor Leah.
All right, put yourself in her shoes, or sandals, as the case may be. Right? What is her place in all of this?
The unloved wife.
The unloved wife.
First wife.
The unloved first wife, right? Which, even to this day, we still have too common a trope in movies and theaters and in real life of a first wife who might be loyal to a husband and then being sort of cast aside and then replaced by a trophy wife. Leah only got a week with her husband, and then she kind of gets replaced by the trophy wife, by the one that's actually more attractive and the one that he really wanted.
I've always noticed, I've been wondering, in the Avot, in the Amidah,
Mm-hmm.
we do Sarah, Rebecca,
Rachel and Leah.
Rachel,
Leah last.
and Leah comes last.
Mhm.
Even though the other two in sequence, she should come.
It's a quote. The same reason that we do Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, that we do that as with the Elohei, 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 is because it's a quote, right? Most of the content of our tefillot are quotes or slight paraphrases from other parts of the Tanakh. And the idea that you would list the matriarchs in Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, that is how the Tanakh lists them. So whether or not you think it's fair, that is the way that the actual text of the Bible describes them in that order. And so when we were putting the matriarchs into the Amidah, it was decided that it would be appropriate to keep it in the order that the Bible actually uses their names. Now, this is an aside, a secondary aside, a footnote to the footnote. In the Reform world, there are versions of that text that do reverse, that do say Leah first and then Rachel, because there are people who are trying to defend Leah's honor. There are also people who insert Bilhah and Zilpah, the two handmaidens, as well, because they want to also defend them as also mothers of the tribes of Israel. And there comes a certain point, however, in this rabbi's humble opinion, where you are trying to make statements with the prayer rather than let this prayer make some sort of impact on you.
Right.
Right? It's not a political platform. Right? When we put together a prayer, we are not trying to make a statement of this is what we believe and therefore must apply to everything else. We are trying to use the words of our tradition in order to then guide us. And yes, still come to the conclusion that Leah deserves respect, that Bilhah and Zilpah deserve respect, of course, but that doesn't mean that they have to be shoehorned into that text. But that's a footnote to a footnote. All right, so we're going to start off and we're going to focus quite a bit on Leah, and then we're going to loop back around to Rachel because both of them get some difficult treatment in this section because both of them are suffering from the same condition.
Their father.
Their father, their husband. Yeah, no. I'm talking about a physical infertility. Right? Both Leah and Rachel suffer from infertility, as does Rivka, as does Sarah. Right? All of the matriarchs that are predominantly listed, right? Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, all of them struggle with infertility at least once during their time. Some of them more than once. So this is a recurring theme, and part of that is what we'll be looking at in our commentary. But first, let's go ahead and see that Leah has more on her plate than just being infertile. She's got other issues to deal with. Would you mind reading for us? We are on page 173. 173, chapter 9, verse 31. Okay, having just finished the wedding party for Rachel, where we found out how much Jacob loved her and all of that, and that he's going to be working for another 7 years because of the shenanigans, we now go on in verse 31 to hear a little bit more about Leah.
The Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren.
All right, so pause real quick. So for those of you that are a little bit more familiar with the Hebrew, if you look over at verse 31, what word is used literally in the Hebrew for, in quote, unloved? Snua, which, how would you translate that more directly? Hated.
Oh.
Right? So the question here, and our commentators are going to deal with this, is why is she unloved? And is it unloved or is it hated?
Or loveless.
Exactly. Or is it love minus? Right? Is it just a relative term? Look, he loved Rachel. Right? That's what we got in the verse right before. And he loved her a reduced amount. Right? Is it just a reduction of love? Or is it actual hate? Or is it just indifference? Right? What is actually going on and why? Why would there be this relationship strife? Now, before we get into the commentaries, which we'll wait until we finish our Torah text, off the top of your head or from your own previous reflections on this, why do you think it might be that Jacob would have one of these feelings towards Leah?
Because she was complicit in the keeping the veil down.
Fooling him.
Right, okay.
She was complicit in it.
She knew he loved Rachel.
She knew what the
He
score
made his
was.
intentions clear.
Right. She knew that the wedding was supposed to be between Jacob and Rachel. So when she went along with it, what is Jacob supposed to think except you tricked me? Not just your father tricked me.
Yeah.
You tricked me. I mean, sure, fine, your father really probably pressured you to do this, but you could have said no, right? Maybe?
Maybe not.
Maybe not. Well, so disobeying the leader of a household can be very difficult depending upon what culture and circumstances they're in. I mean, there are places in the world today where the head of the household still has life or death over the people that are there. There are still honor killings and other types of things where women in particular are vulnerable to the whims of the leader of the house, but men as well. So maybe she didn't have 100% free will, but even still, he's now stuck with her.
Resentment.
So there's a resentment here, right? Because if you're stuck with somebody that you didn't want to be with, you have to take care of them, and you have to provide for them, and you have to do all sorts of, what's that?
You have to have children with them?
You have to have children with them. At least, we know from the Torah later on that that's definitely codified, but it seems to have also been part of the culture even pre-Torah, which was that a husband had to be familiar with his wife. They needed intimacy between each other. And therefore, how much would you enjoy that kind of relationship? But it was expected, right? And therefore demanded, and therefore what was going to be done. And Leah, of course, would have no other options, right? It's not like she can leave. It's not like she can take another husband. He can take another wife, but she can't.
If Leah was the oldest one,
Mhm.
and Laban said, we marry off the oldest one first. If Rachel was married first, was there a stigma carried on Leah that she wasn't?
That seems to be the implication of Laban's terms. It also seems to be the implication that they simply wouldn't have allowed it. That it wasn't even just a question of would it be like problematic for the eldest to get married after the youngest. That seems to be a given, but it seems like it's even implying that it might have been like illegal for the youngest to get married before the eldest.
Wouldn't Rachel have known if there was this so-called tradition or law that she couldn't marry him?
Okay. So this is also why a lot of people say Lavan is just cheating, right? Because Jacob had lived there for 7 years. Do you think there hadn't been any other weddings in the entire community for 7 years? This issue of eldest has to come first had never come up in 7 years. Some commentators say yes, it did, and Jacob was worried, and that Rachel also knew that this was an issue, and that they had gone to Lavan, and Lavan said, "Don't worry, we'll allow it," and all that. So that Lavan had lied and had calmed their fears. There are other people who say that Rachel and Leah had come up with a very complicated call sign.
Yes.
Well, that Rachel and Jacob had originally worked out a plan that they could expose Lavan's deception, but then Rachel felt sorry for her sister because her sister would be then the butt of the joke. And then she let Leah in on it, which meant that now, in addition to hating Leah because he didn't want to be married to her, he's also hating Leah because without Leah, his own relationship with Rachel would be in a better place. Because he's now resentful of Rachel, the one he actually loves, because Rachel is the one in this particular reading that helped bring Leah into the program.
Is this
So-
as the world turns?
It's
The soap opera.
people are complicated, okay? This whole human emotions is a very, very difficult thing to navigate.
I wonder where the drama comes from.
And we're going to see how well this gets handled is very questionable. Now, notice one additional thing here, right? The Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, right? But Rachel was barren. So that phrase, "open the womb," as we're going to see from one of the commentaries, but I just want to make sure we get this at the beginning so that you don't go through the whole rest of the text without thinking about this, implies our commentaries that before this, she was not fertile, right? The phrase "to open the womb" is not a term for conception. It is not a term for reached childbearing age. The phrase "open the womb" in biblical idiom means had not been able to have children and now can have children. So the idea here is that Leah was barren and that God opens up her womb. Why? That's why for both questions is something to have in the back of your head. Why was she barren before this? And why did God choose to open her womb at this point? Right?
Well, how would you know that she was barren? They didn't have the test that we have. She hadn't been married before. She's only been married to the guy for a week.
Very true.
So
Yes.
God lets her have a child, but when he does it with Rachel, she doesn't.
Right. But we, the omniscient reader, we know whether or not she's barren. But maybe she knew as well, right? Because there are certain biological signs, like if a woman is not menstruating, then you're absolutely within your right to assume that she is having fertility issues when she's already reached an age when menstruation would be common, or if menstruation has stopped prematurely, long before you might have thought it would actually come in at menopause. Then there are reasons why she might have thought that she was barren. We'll come back to these questions with the commentaries, but I just want to have that percolating in the back of your mind.
In those days, were they even teenagers when they got married?
So it's
It's
right.
Because 14, 15, 16 is nothing back then.
Well,
Some
getting married,
cultures-
yes, but having children, they still often would wait. The beginning of fertility for women began much later than it does today. because we have a much lower stress life and much better nutrition. That creates fertility at an earlier age among women. In the ancient world and around the world today, in more impoverished communities, menstruation and fertility will begin later. So they may not have had an expectation of fertility until they were well into their teen years at least.
If they were both young.
Well, remember, he fell in love with her 7 years ago. So however old she was when he fell in love with her, he's added 7 to that number, and Rachel was the younger one. So Leah would be at least a year older at the very least than Rachel. So we've got at least 8 years going from when he arrived before they actually start trying to make a family. Okay, but let's talk about that family.
Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben, for she declared, it means the Lord has seen my afflictions.
Okay, now, sorry, go ahead.
It also means now my husband will love me.
Okay, but what does it literally mean? Ooh, vain. Look, a son. Right? It's literally a command to her husband or the community, which is basically, I know you love her more, but I've given you a son. Right? So now, love me. Right? Love me because I am the one providing you with children, because Rachel is not. Right? She may have the looks, but she's not actually producing offspring. And doesn't that say something? She is saying to her husband. Onward.
She conceived again and bore a son and declared, this is because the Lord heard that I was unloved and has given me this one also. So she named him Simeon.
Right. And again, this is the second son unanswered by Rachel. Right. So now it's 2 boys coming in, which means we're talking about multiple years passing with Rachel giving none.
Again, she conceived and bore a son and declared, this time my husband will become attached to me, for I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore, he was named Levi.
All right. So pause real quick. Notice a pattern with the naming.
She keeps saying, now he'll love me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now he'll.
She is begging for her husband's love through the production of children.
Yeah.
Right.
How sad that is for her.
It is
Yeah, oh,
absolutely heartbreaking. It is
Yeah.
just painful. Every time we read this section of the Torah, it is just you hearing her pitiful cry of, love me, please. Look, children, please love me because I've given you a child. And from everything we've seen, he has no problem loving the children.
Right.
But he's still not really loving her because through 3 kids, she's still not getting the love apparently that she expects, because for 3 kids, she keeps naming them, I'm not loved, or the equivalent of.
So sad.
So we've got at least 3, probably more likely 6 or 7 or 8 years going through here, depending upon how long each gestation and then weaning took. And it's just, she is living with this pain this entire time.
Yeah.
And then we get son number 4.
She conceived again and bore a son and declared, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore, she named him Judah, and then she stopped bearing.
Okay, so something happened.
Yep.
There's a change.
You give thanks to God.
She gives thanks to God rather than giving another begging, plea to her husband. Right? She seems with Judah to no longer be producing children for him. She's now having children because she is having children.
Mhm.
And she's thanking God for this fourth son, rather than saying, love me, while holding the son up to her husband. So there seems to have been this major change in her maturation. And I should point out that according to the many commentators, not one of the ones that I brought today, the reason she stops bearing here is actually because of her own choice. Right? Her own prayer is that she should no longer have more children. Right? Because she's worried about having too many children and her sister having none. That's not fair to Rachel. Which is why it's not surprising that chapter 30 turns to Rachel.
Oh. When Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children, she became envious of her sister. And Rachel said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob was incensed at Rachel and said, can I take the place of God who has denied you fruit of the womb?
All right. So, lovely little episode of family counseling.
Yeah.
Well, these 2 people come in. And she says, I want sons, he won't give me any. And he says, what am I, God? I'm gonna, God's the one who's making you barren. Right? We can imagine these two people sitting on the sofa talking to the counselor.
Yeah.
Okay. Who's right? Is she right or is he right?
Well, probably he's right, because you figure that they're having relationships and she's just not getting pregnant. So
Right.
it's not him.
And how do we know it's not him?
Because he has.
Because he's got 4 other kids.
Right,
It's almost like
exactly.
with Sarah and Abraham.
Mhm.
And when the messenger comes to say, you're to Sarah and Abraham, you're gonna have a child, Sarah says 2 things. She says, she says, how can I? I'm old. And she also says, he's old too.
Right. Right. But here we know he's not too old because he's popping children out of her sister, no problem. So it really is very clear to her that it's her. Which, by the way, also was a painful reminder to Sarah when Abraham had a child, Ishmael, through Hagar.
Right.
That was also, Sarah went, okay, up until this point, I could think that it maybe was him, maybe it was me. Now I know it's me. Right? Same thing seems to be happening
She
here.
had known it anyway, because she had already gone through menopause. So
Well, the ages are of question of how long she was in the different biological stages of life. But yes, it was a slap in the face, to say the least. Who else was also infertile? Rivka. Right? What happened when Rivka was infertile? How did that get fixed?
Isaac prayed for her.
Isaac prayed for her. Right? Isaac prayed for her. And then she conceived. That doesn't seem to be Jacob's response here.
Well, no, Jacob is the man.
Well, I
He
mean,
said, "Oh, so
It's
it's
her.
right. Well, so was Isaac.
But Jacob gets angry. That was the difference.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Jacob gets angry. But the question is, why is he getting angry? Right? I mean, she's upset about this. She's hurt. Why is he taking it personally? Why is he getting furious at this? And why his answer of, what am I, God? I mean, no, but who said you were?
But I guess by her demanding children from him has just made him just off the chart man. Yeah.
Right. So,
And he knows it's not his fault.
well, he knows biologically it's not his fault. Right? He knows that his own fertility is not under question. But the question of whether there's some other reason why the infertility is happening to the various characters in the story, that's something our different commentators will have to help us walk through. Okay, so we're going to begin with God supports all those who have fallen. We're on the top of that page. Everyone found it?
Yep. Okay.
All those who have fallen, these are the barren, those who have fallen within their household.
Okay, so pause real quick. This is from Bereshit Rabbah, the great Midrash collection. What is that implying about what happens to a person when they are barren within a household in terms of their standing within the household?
They lose face.
They lose face, right? They lose standing. They're not as respected. They do not have the same place. They are also more vulnerable. Remember, there was no such thing as a pension, no such thing as Social Security, and that was doubly true for women. So if you are the extra wife and the guy has children all with another wife, and then the guy dies, who inherits? The kids,
Children, the
right?
son.
But if all the kids come from the other mother, how much support do you think the second wife is going to get?
Very little.
Well, it would up to their hearts, right? I mean, we'd hope they would support her just fine, but depending upon rivalry, they may be more than happy to say to mom's rival, get out. Wouldn't always be justified, but it certainly would not be an uncommon thing. Having a child of your own meant that you now had an anchor to prevent you from being in that situation in old age.
But wouldn't that have only been for the male child? Because the male child was the one who had to provide for the parents. So if it was a girl child, she was to marry and go.
Well, the male child had the resources to provide for the parents, yes. And you're right, the girl child was going to be marrying someone else who had the economic resources, meaning the land.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
All right, so God sees somebody who has fallen, who has had this status issue.
And God straightens the bent. When the Holy One, blessed be He, rewards them with children, they straighten up in joy. Similarly, Leah was hated by her household, And when the Holy One, blessed be he, visited her and gave her pregnancy, she was straightened.
Okay, so Bereshit Rabbah, why did God help her become fertile?
So she wouldn't be hated?
So she wouldn't be hated, right? God was lifting her the way God lifts others that are in difficult situation, right? People are bowed under tragedy. God will provide them with a way of lifting up out of that tragedy, right? That seems to be Bereshit Rabbah's take on why it was that we had that whole opening of that God saw that she was hated and God opened her womb, right? God is going, man, they're treating her terrible. I know what I can do to help her. I'll make sure that she can have children. Right. We see something similar, by the way, in the story of Elisha and the Shunammite woman. Right? Not that she's bowed or necessarily suffering in her community. We certainly don't see that she's hated. But hey, I want to do something nice for her. Let's let her have children. Make sense?
It also says that she was hated by her household, which means she wasn't quite liked by everyone.
Well, okay. So if you go back and you look at the verse 31, right? It saw that she was hated, that she was unloved. We sort of read into that we were talking about Jacob's feelings towards her.
Yeah.
Because that certainly is a normal reading after verse 29, or sorry, verse 30, where we see that Jacob loves Rachel. To then hear about the unloved / hated person, we assume that the relationship we're talking about there is also from Jacob. What Bereshit Rabbah is trying to say is no, the issue of her infertility was bigger than just husband-wife relationship. It was her standing in the household, right? And the household was, the community basically.
Yeah.
So this wasn't just a question of she wasn't liked by her husband. This was a question of she was not esteemed by the entire household because she wasn't able to have children, or maybe that's why she was hated, right? Again, she might have been hated because she was seen as this interloper, because if all the other kids are coming from Rachel, or from, if all the people knew that Rachel was the preferred one and she's now stuck here, she may have been in low esteem just because she was an interloper in the eyes of everyone, not only in the eyes of Jacob.
And
So
Rachel was the pretty girl.
And Rachel was definitely the better looking one. Yes.
And this way she gets status.
She gets status.
Right.
She is lifted up.
Yeah.
Okay, so Bereshit Rabbah. Sforno has a different idea.
Leah was hated because after his first meeting with her, Yaakov recognized that Leah bore the symptoms of a woman who was unable to have children.
Okay, Sforno's a little rougher here.
Oh.
Why doesn't he like Leah?
He already knows she won't have children.
Because she can't have kids.
Well, how would he know that?
Well, there were signs. The idea that a person could tell whether or not someone was fertile. Well, but people have believed many different times in history that yes, they can. Right? There are people who believed you can tell things by the shape of a person's head, or that you can tell things by the color of the white of their eye. Right? There's all sorts of things that doctors used to diagnose people by the smell of their urine. So there were all sorts of beliefs about being able to identify signs of fertility or other things. So here, Jacob doesn't like her because she's not fertile, right? Which is very, very painful to read. Now, who else do we know that wasn't fertile? Well, Rivka wasn't fertile, yet Isaac loved her, right? Sarah wasn't fertile, yet Abraham loved her, right? So the idea that you wouldn't be loved because you weren't fertile does not seem to be a normal opinion. That seems to be Jacob's opinion.
But the other two were beautiful.
I mean, they had something else going for them.
Yeah, because they.
Okay, so one way to read this.
But poor Leah had nothing. She had looks.
Right. So one way to read this,
fertile.
right, is to say, look, she wasn't supposed to be in his household anyway. He didn't want her in the household. The one possible redeeming feature she could have had would have been fertility. At least she could have made babies. And if he thought she wasn't even good for that, then he absolutely could see her as just being a chain around his neck. That he is now stuck. Right. Now, again, not talking about this being a pleasant or laudable emotion, right? But this could be part of the grounds. And certainly it is not uncommon for couples that are facing fertility issues for there to be a great deal of resentment and anger between the different people in that relationship. Even if, like in this case, we know that Jacob is fertile, right? Even if he knows he's fertile and she isn't, that doesn't mean that there can't still be this reverse, anger that goes back and forth between them, even if it is totally irrational. People do things like that. All right, Sforno, though, continues.
Yaakov had thought that the reason Leah had been willing to deceive him was because of her awareness of her barrenness. She remained in such a state until God took pity on her and opened her womb.
Okay, so now we get the specific explanation. So Forno was, again, trying to unpack our cryptic phrase of she was hated and God opened her womb, of basically why would those two things be related? And what Sephorno was saying is the reason Jacob, he's now identifying Jacob as the source of the antipathy, that the reason Jacob didn't like her was because of her barrenness, and specifically that Jacob believed that because Leah knew she was barren, Leah went through the deception to get married to him because no one else was going to knowingly marry a barren woman. Right? So that is what Sforno was trying to say as the course. It's not just that she tricked him.
That's pretty far-fetched.
It's that he's trying to read the text carefully. And the text says she was hated and her womb got opened when God helped her. So it seems to be then that the hate would be linked to her womb not being opened. Because if God is providing a solution, then the solution has to be linked to the problem. At least that's the way Sforno was breaking it down. Now, we already saw Bereshit Rabbah had a different understanding of that. But again, multiple commentators, multiple opinions, they can all be something that we can learn from and give us insight. So what Sforno was trying to say here is Jacob didn't like her because he thought she had knowingly tricked him, knowing she was infertile because no one else would have had her otherwise. And so now she is truly this anchor around his neck. And she knew that's what she was doing when she did it. And God wants to solve that problem by taking away the infertility. And now she can be somebody who is not seen as this weight around his neck. And indeed, she sort of tries to say, look, I'm not barren. I'm producing children, right? Don't think of me as this woman who deceived you to get married because I had no other chances, right? I'm making children. Love me now, love me now, love me now. At least for the first 3 times.
Yeah.
Make sense? Okay. Let's go ahead and see how Radak unpacks all of this.
Yeah, Yaakov did not hate her. In fact, he thought he loved her. However, seeing that he loved Rachel better, it appeared as if he hated Leah. We can find a similar situation in Deuteronomy, where the Torah speaks about a husband hating one of his 2 wives. The meaning there is also relative to the wife he prefers.
All right. So if someone says, oh, I love chocolate and I hate vanilla, does it mean they actually think vanilla should be wiped from the face of the earth? Probably not. It just means compared to chocolate, vanilla is not so much, right? Vanilla is okay, but chocolate is the real thing, right? That's how Radak and many other commentators read this. God forbid we think that Jacob hated her, right? And that she had to suffer like that. Instead, she was knowingly second best, right? That doesn't mean that she was worst. It just means second best. And the silver medal in the Olympics is not so bad.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I don't want to have a goal.
well, and actually there are interesting psychological studies that show the bronze winners are much happier than silver winners. But that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah, because bronze winners can look and say, I almost didn't make it on the platform. Whereas silver winners say, I almost got gold. And that change of perspective makes a big difference in our sense of gratitude and happiness.
Wow.
Yeah. But in this particular case, that's what they're arguing, is that no, he wouldn't hate her, right? Because if he hated her, he just would have divorced her. So it must be instead a relative status issue, that there is your preferred wife and then there is the other one. And the other one doesn't mean that you actually treat her in any despicable manner, which will then inform the rest of how he reads
So
this.
God, who knew the true state of affairs, that is, what Leah's perception of her husband's feelings were toward her, God was compassionate to her. Seeing that the Torah describes her womb as needing to be opened, it is clear that she had been barren before.
As we've talked about, right? So God says, okay, look, she is this, she thinks that she's being judged by her husband for this infertility and for all of this other things, but really it's just a question of ranking, and there's always going to be a number 2 if there's a number 1. So therefore, God tried to help her feel better by giving her fertility. However, that's going to open this question of infertility in general.
Yeah, but Rachel remained barren, as she had been. We already explained why the matriarchs were basically all barren until God intervened visibly.
Okay, so he talks about this 25:20, and I have conveniently brought to you his commentary from Genesis 25:20.
Oh.
Why, in Radak's opinion, very important to remind you, this is one commentator's opinion, why it is that Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah all struggled with infertility.
The verse tells us that God intervened benevolently in Yitzhak's life, just as he had done in the life of Yitzhak's father. The fact is proven when we consider that Yitzhak married her at 40, and until he was 60, he could not father a child.
20 years of infertility.
God had deliberately intervened in the bodies of our matriarchs in order to demonstrate to the nations of the world that he loved Abraham and Yitzhak, and therefore God performed miracles to enable their wives to bear children for them.
All right, so basic reading that Radak is trying to get to us is the reason why they were infertile is because that made a blank canvas, if you will, upon which God could paint the masterpiece of his intervention to help Abraham, Isaac, and then later Jacob, to help this line of people that God cherished so much because of their views about God and the justice that they would try to promulgate. And one more little wrinkle.
Yeah, our sages conclude from the barrenness of the women that God so looked forward to the prayers of the patriarchs that he sort of quasi-provoked them into praying for the gift of children.
I thought you'd all appreciate that last line.
Oh, it's awful.
Well,
Yeah.
is
Is
it?
it 20 years?
It's almost like the concept of divine suffering, which I've mentioned before. There's this stuff they're going to suffer, so then they're going to turn more in prayer,
Mhm.
and God delights in the prayers of the righteous. So
How you
how
get
do you encourage that to happen?
you want to make the relationship grow, you need to have those moments where you can be together of crisis. So if you're God, you just institute some of the crises. So that way they'll come running. I can see that you're not exactly 100%
No.
happy with that particular reading.
Yeah.
Right? But what Radak is struggling with is this concept of this recurring theme of infertility, which other commentators will also try to provide a different forms of answers to. All right, so let's go ahead and see what Kedushat Levi says about this idea with Leah.
When the quote is, when God saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb. There's a somewhat enigmatic comment on this verse in Agadah, according to which some of Leah's descendants would be enemies of God. This is why she is called here hated, in reference to the wicked deeds of some of her offspring. Like the angels protested Leah's having children, as they saw that on account of Zimri from the tribe of Shimon, 24,000 Israelites would lose their lives and not enter the land of Israel.
Okay, so what is the first account that he's bringing? He's going to reject that in a second, but the account is Leah was hated because hundreds of years from now, kids would do horrible stuff. Well, if you're God, it's not just a prediction, you've already seen it happen, right? You were there, you will be there, you are there. It's all, the time is all one constant thing that's unfolded before you, right? It's not like the rest of us, you have to scroll through the map. God sees the whole thing. So the idea would be, she was hated because some of her kids were going to mess up. Right? So what's wrong with that?
Wait a minute.
Right.
Wait, she was hated because 400 years, 500 years later,
For example.
Yeah.
her descendants
Mhm.
did X, Y, and Z.
Yep.
And God can't do anything about that.
Mm.
So he just reverts to making her suffer.
Well, no. So he's actually fixing her suffering. Remember?
Right.
That she's having children.
But she's
Right.
But basically what this is saying is that the hate that she experienced was not a directed personal hate by other people in her time. It is simply saying, in general, there was stuff wrong with Leah because her kids would be wrong.
Her
Right.
descendants.
Yeah,
We're-
her descendants.
We're not even talking.
If tomorrow, next year, 1,000 years from now, it's all the same.
Can I look back 6 generations, 7 generations, and hate Hitler's grandmother 10 generations back because it produced Hitler?
Right.
Yeah, okay, I can hate that.
Could you?
I can see.
Yes.
Yeah, you got the nod.
You talked yourself into it.
Yeah, I got that.
I mean, one of the
I
angels
can
would come
that.
and say, you're one of our kids
Yeah,
is gonna nearly kill all your other kids.
yeah, why don't you just get rid of her
Yeah.
now? Don't have
So
her.
so what you're saying is that you hate Adam.
Oh.
Well,
Right,
wait a
if-
minute.
'cause-
We have the same thing in Purim with, if they had killed all the Amalekites, you
Mhm.
wouldn't have had Haman.
Right?
Look
There's
at-
another one.
If only there had been more killing.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
If only we had killed
If
Adam and Eve, then no one else would have had to die.
Yeah.
There might not have been anyone else.
Exactly. Right? So if we're holding people accountable for every sin that comes later,
Yeah.
Reminds me more of the science fiction movie Terminator.
Yeah.
He comes back
Exactly.
from the future
Yeah.
to take care of the mother
Take
before
care
the
of
kid is
them
Yeah.
born and all of
before
that.
the kid is
So,
Okay.
but that's what that reminds
But
me
Kiddush
more than-
Levi is going to bring,
Any
first of
other
all,
than that.
a proof text from within our classic tradition, and then his own take on this.
So our verse would explain that just as Yishmael at the time in Genesis was not allowed to die from thirst, as at that time he was free from sin, so Leah, who had prayed not to become the wife of the wicked Esau, could not be denied children now on account of something over which she could have no control. She had demonstrated that she hated wickedness, so what more could she have done? Our verse makes it clear that other considerations notwithstanding, Leah's prayer to bear children was answered positively.
All right, so he's throwing a lot of things in here. One is a very common midrash, which was that the reason Leah's eyes were a little messed up is because she found out that she was supposed to marry the eldest of her relatives, right, which was Esau. So someone said, oh, look, Isaac has 2 kids, right? Lavan has 2 kids, well, Rivka and Lavan, right? And so therefore they're going to get married someday. There's a match. It's perfect, right? 2 boys, 2 girls. It's really easy. And Rachel said, oh, well, who's the youngest? And they said, well, Jacob, and he's the guy who lives in the tents and he's so nice and he makes soup and blah, 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 right? And Leah said, oh, good, tell me about my husband. And they said, oh, he's a murderer and a thief. And she's like, oh, God, please, no, right? Please, I do not want to get married to this person. Now, that the Midrash holds to her credit, right? That she would not want to have been married to Esau. And the only way to get out of it was to marry Jacob instead. That's the implication.
Esau was already married at that time.
Yeah, but he took extra wives anyway. So,
Why is
Yeah.
his
Yeah, Leah was
parents-
on the side.
Yeah.
why
well,
is
because his parents
married?
didn't like the Canaanite wives, so he took some more.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
non-Canaanite wives, but still not exactly going well. So Kiddush Levi is trying to bring that as to say, look, Leah is clearly a good person, right? And yes, some of her descendants are going to do bad stuff, but she's not. She's clearly not a bad person. And therefore, we have to believe that God indeed answered her prayer, right? God is willing to answer her prayer to have children.
And
that-
how do they communicate all of this?
How do they what?
How do they communicate all of this?
So where do they get the idea that she prayed for children?
No. You said that Leah didn't want to marry Esau because
Oh, there would have been messengers back and forth that were talking about, the different families in different parts. That just because they lived 100 miles apart doesn't mean that they weren't sending letters and things. All right, because even in American history, when someone would move out west, there were still letters that would go back and forth. It might take a year or two, but you could still have communication.
All right, the Pony Express, yes.
Pony Express was an improvement, and
Yes.
then that got beaten by the telegraph.
Yeah.
All right, onward.
However, the Holy One, blessed be He, immediately hears the prayer a man whispers in his heart. Whence do we know this? From Hannah. It said, now Hannah, she spoke in her heart. That was in Samuel. You may know this also from Rachel and Leah. At first, Leah was not considered worthy of marrying anyone but Esau, while Rachel was destined to wed Jacob. Leah would sit at the crossroads, inquiring about Esau's actions, and they would tell her, oh, he's a wicked man. He sheds blood. He waylays passersby. He is covered with red hair as a garment and commits every kind of abomination against God. Upon hearing all of this, Leah would cry bitterly, my sister Rachel and I were born of the same womb, yet Rachel is to marry the righteous man, and I, the wicked Esau?
Right. So this is, the lament that many people have. It's like, wait a minute, it's not fair.
Not fair.
Right? We come from the same place, and yet she has the luck to get the good guy, and I got the luck to get the bad guy. That's not fair. How do you change something that's not fair? Well, you you pray, you engage it. Obviously, there are other ways to do it when it's within your control, but Leah is very much a passive member of what her family is trying to implement. And so she turns in the only resource that she has available to her, which is to prayer.
She wept and she fasted until her sight became weak. And that's why it's written, and Leah's eyes were weak. And the Lord saw that Leah was hated. This verse indicates that Esau's actions were hateful to her. But however, when Rachel learned that she was to marry Jacob, she was elated and became arrogant. Once they were both married to Jacob, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, she cried and fasted and despised Esau's behavior and prayed to me. It would be unjust to keep her from the righteous one. Indeed, I will let her bear sons first. Thus it said, and the Lord saw that Leah was hated.
All right, so it turns out that Rachel gets a little uppity when she thinks that she's going to marry the good one and her sister, and she thinks that that's her, her due. It's like, no, it was luck that you were set up to marry this guy. If Jacob had come out first, it would have been reversed, or Leah and Rachel had come out. But Jacob and Esau being twins, it's more likely that could have happened. So why should Rachel get the right to be in a better status when she's not behaving in a necessarily laudable way? And, it's just luck that she got the good guy in the first place. Instead, God says, thanks to what Leah has done and the way that she has shown her disappointment with the evil that she was presented with, let her also join to Jacob and let her also have the privilege of having the kids first, right? So that she should not do this. Because she hated Esau, let her find happiness here. It's an interesting way of looking at it from the Midrash. Okay, but let's turn to Rachel. We've only got 5 minutes left.
Yeah,
we'll see what we can do.
Rashbam said, Rachel was punished for having said to Yaakov, get me children.
Right, so Rashbam, remember we asked you before, if you're at the marriage counselor, which one of these people is wrong? Rashbam says Rachel is wrong, right? She had no right to go to her husband and say, give me kids, right? Give me sons. What kind of thing is that? Right? Okay, fine. I understand you're having difficulties. You're emotionally hurt, but you're not allowed to go and berate your husband like this. That is inappropriate. Rashi, on the other hand.
Yeah, Leah said, I am a dead woman. One may infer from this that he who is childless may be regarded as dead.
Right. So, but probably better translated as one who is childless. That basically that in the norms of the day, if you were childless, you were basically dead. Right? You're a dead stump. Right? Your tree will no longer grow. There will be no fruit to sustain you in old age. You're basically dead. So when she says, I'm dead, it's a very powerful statement. And indeed, maybe she had a right to be vengeful. Maybe she had a right to be afraid. Maybe she had a right to be angry. And so the expression, give me children should be seen coming from that place rather than just a irrational outburst. Or Chachayim.
Yes, on the phrase, Rachel saw that she had not borne children, etc. The Torah adds the words for Jacob, since it was clear that Jacob was not the one who was sterile.
Right. So again, why does it say Rachel saw that she had borne no children for Jacob? Why do you have to add the words in for Jacob? We know who her husband is because it's reminding us that Jacob is definitely not sterile. He's got 4 kids to his name. It's not a problem with his plumbing.
So the cause therefore had to lie with her. When the Torah describes Rachel as jealous of her sister, this indicates that had Leah not been her sister, Rachel would have attributed the fact that she did not conceive to genetic differences between her and another wife of Jacob. She could not account for such genetic differences, however, when it's her own sister who's involved, that is, someone who is genetically similarly equipped, she thought.
All right, so Or HaChaim is trying to pull apart her phrase. No children for Jacob and envious of her sister. Why for Jacob? Because he must have been fine because he was having kids. Why envious of her sister? Because her sister was having kids, right? And if it's her sister having kids, then you can't just say it's a family problem, right? It's not just me, it's my whole family. We have trouble with fertility, blah, blah, blah. No, my sister, she's out there popping out kids. Me, I'm not. Well, what's the difference, right? We both come from the same family. Now, nowadays in modern science, we know that 2 people who come from the same family can still have very different genetics and very different genetic issues. But back in those days, obviously, that was not as understood. And certainly a person reflecting on their own status might have felt even more offended and personally hurt that everyone else in the relationship was doing just fine except her. Now, we know that Leah is not doing so great. Because after all, especially for the first 3 kids, she is still desperate for signs of her husband's affection. But from Rachel's point of view, at least she has kids. And that is one of the things that's so true in many arguments in many families, where each side feels that they're the only one who has a legitimate thing to be upset about. That, well, you already have blah, blah, so why are you upset? Or, well, at least you blah, not realizing, look, they're upset, they're hurt, you're upset, you're hurt. Stop trying to compare. Stop trying to say the other person's hurt and pain is illegitimate. But unfortunately, that does still happen.
And this many thousands of years later, we still have sibling rivalry.
You noticed?
According to the sages, it was wrong of Jacob to become angry. After all, a great many people prayed on behalf of barren women. His punishment was that in the end, his other children were obliged to bow before her son.
Joseph, right? Joseph.
Oh, Joseph.
Right. So the idea is that
Right.
all she
That's right.
wanted was for you to do for her what your dad did for your mom. Right? That's all she wanted. So why were you getting angry? Right? She just meant pray for me. What's the big deal? Well, as to what's the big deal, that's what our next 2 commentators are going to try and help us understand.
So Rachel demanded that Yaakov pray on her behalf, failing which she would die. She considered any woman who had no children as dead.
As we saw from Rashi.
Yeah, and Rambam expresses his amazement at such an interpretation, as he cannot understand why this would infuriate Yaakov. One even prays on behalf of people to whom one is not married. So why should he feel offended by her demand that he pray on behalf of his wife?
All right. So again, it's a very common commentator line of argument, which is to say, I understand your interpretation, but if that was the thing, it doesn't fit the outcome, right? So if all she was asking for was to be prayed for, then why in the world would Jacob be angry? Because we pray for people all the time. We pray for people we're not even married to. Why would you not pray for your own wife? And why would you be angry if your wife asked you to pray on behalf of her current situation, right? So because we assume that Jacob is not totally evil and irrational, we have to then understand that there must have been something else going on than just she asked him to pray. Make sense? All right.
As to the comment by the Midrash that Yaakov rejected the comparison with Yitzchak praying for Rivka to have children as inappropriate, seeing that Yitzchak at the time did not have children, whereas he, Yaakov, did already have 4 children, surely that is not a reason why he should not pray on behalf of his wife,
Okay. Favorite wife.
a favorite wife.
All right. So he's like, look, I know that in the Midrash it says that Jacob said, look, you can't compare me and my dad to praying for my mom or me praying for you. Because when my dad prayed for my mom, he had no kids. So he was also praying for himself.
Oh,
But me, I've got 4. So tough.
wow.
Right. And
Yes.
yet what the tour here is saying is, no, don't think that's what Jacob was actually doing. Right? That doesn't make sense. Because why would he have not prayed for his beloved wife? If it was maybe Leah that had been asked to pray for her, maybe we'd understand why he wouldn't want to pray on her behalf because of the relationship issues we talked about and her being snu'av, her being hated. But why would you not assume that he'd be willing to pray for at least the woman he loved? All right, so what is going on here?
According to the plain meaning of the text, Rachel demanded children from her husband. She threatened that if he refused to pray on her behalf, she would kill herself. She would not lay a hand on herself, but she explained that she would simply die from frustration and shame and would blame her death on her husband.
All right, so now we understand that the stakes here are not just, oh, woe is me, but she's basically saying, I'm going to die without kids, and I need you to help me get them. And that second half, I need you to help me get them, is going to be the kicker for the tour.
But Yaakov's anger was aroused because she so misunderstood the power of prayer that she felt that the prayer of a tzaddik automatically commits God to fulfill it.
Right? If a tzaddik prays for it, God
Done.
has to do it, right? As though the tzaddik is the one pulling the levers on God.
After telling Rachel that the matter was not really in his hands, seeing that God had granted him children, just not from her, she decided to pray on her own behalf. This is what the Torah means when it says, God listened to her, as a result of which she bore Joseph.
Okay, so when you go further into the story of the birthing of the different children, when we get to Joseph's story, it's God listens to her. Right? And what the Torah is trying to tell us here, and it's more telling us rather than telling Jacob, is that asking someone else to pray on your behalf is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with saying, say Mishaberach for me, I'm going in for surgery or something like that. And we should be praying for other people all the time, that we have that knowledge that they're in need. But the idea that one person's prayer, because they are the righteous person or the holy person or whatever, is somehow the one that will be the magic prayer, and that other people's prayers don't count, that is what got Jacob angry. And that's what should get us angry, right? Anyone who says, if you give me $10,000, I'll pray to cure your cancer, and no one else can command God like I do, which, by the way, there are people who are being arrested for things like that, both in this country and many cases in Israel. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these fake Kabbalists just, use that scam for cancer, for children, for sorts of things. And it's absolutely predatory and horrible. And we should know that that's not even possible. And we should know that such behavior should anger us, and well as anyone else with a heart. All right, last paragraph.
One should pray to God and not employ any intermediary. This belief is clarified in the book of Bereshit. We find that the patriarchs all prayed to God without any intermediary at all. The sages already said in Brachot, the prayers were established by the patriarchs. And we have found that Abraham prayed in the event with Sodom, and Yitzchak prayed for his wife Rivka, and Yaakov prayed as they taught Bereshit, and he was what? Pogea in the place. This is what Yaakov actually meant when he said, am I in the place of God who has withheld children? He meant that one should not place any intermediary between himself and God. Therefore, Yaakov was angry at Rachel, for she wished to place him between her and God when she said, grant me children. He knew that Rachel was not irrational, thinking that Yaakov could grant children. Rather, she meant that he should be an intermediary, and this was what enraged him. All of this is clear.
Yeah, well, with help, yes.
Really clear.
I just always love when the commentators will say that.
It's
So,
so clear.
but the conclusion here is a very important and very powerful one, right? When Abraham wanted God to not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he prayed to God. When Isaac wanted there to be children with him and Rivka, he prayed to God. Right? He didn't pray to an angel. He didn't pray to another person. He didn't ask another person to pray on his behalf because he couldn't do it. He knew that the connection needs to be between person and God directly. And that is what this little line about, who am I? Am I God? Is not just the argument of two people sitting in a marriage counselor. It's the argument of two people who are going through a huge interpersonal crisis, also with an overlay of various theological implications.
The line in the service, I am a servant of the Holy One, not on angels nor on mortals do I rely.
Right, from the section that finishes with the paragraph Be'ana Rachetz, right? Be'ana Rachetz, right? That taken from the Zohar is a reminder that we do not worship angels, we do not worship other people, we do not worship anything except God. And that is how we should always direct ourselves. Now, the real painful part of this whole story, though, is that they were having two arguments at once. Right? She was having an argument about her own personal status and the pain she was going through, and he was having an argument about what was considered right and proper with our relationship to God. And they didn't hear each other, which is why it takes some time before this finally gets resolved. And it gets resolved, as our commentators have said, by Rachel petitioning God directly, and also by buying some aphrodisiacs.
And the other thing that I really like about this, in terms of today's modern terms, the prayers of men and women count equally.
Of course, well, they always did.
I know, but
Yeah.
today's day, you have
Unfortunately,
this,
some people seem to miss that point. Yes,
Right.
but yes, the commentators clearly say Leah prayed, and she was the one, and she was able to have her womb open. Rachel prayed, she was able to have children. Right? Yes,
and Jacob
Isaac.
was even saying, "You pray."
Right. It's that each person prays. It doesn't mean we can't pray on behalf of others, but we should never think that another person's prayers somehow count more than ours, or that I don't have to pray because that person's doing it, or that I can't pray because that person could and I'm not like them.
Not that I'm competitive, but Leah wins.
In terms,
Judah is the royal family, and Judah is
Oh.
Mashiach.
the breakdown of all the different tribes and how they line up in Jewish history is fascinating. And yes, if we want to talk about which wife, which wife actually produces the most children, which wife produces the most people of Israel, which wife produces the most powerful parts of Israel. historically, in the long run, yes, Leah wins.
Leah wins
However, in the
always.
short term,
Short run.
In the short run.
Ephraim and Manasseh, which come
Yes.
from Joseph, which is the firstborn of Rachel, is absolutely the most populous and the most prosperous part of the people of Israel. Unfortunately, they also are the group that messes up the worst and end up being wiped out by the Assyrians.
Yeah, the half world. This week.
Which is actually a good lesson.